Today I'm going to be talking about cellular respiration. So why do we respire? What is the purpose of this cycle? The whole purpose is to form ATP, which is the main energy source for our body. And so we need a reusable cycle in order to constantly form some form of ATP. The three stages can be broken up into glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain. So first we're going to start with glycolysis. Okay, what is glycolysis? Glycolysis is a cycle that occurs in the cell cytoplasm. It's anaerobic, which means it does not require oxygen in order for the cycle to continue. And the entire idea is that we start off with glucose. Glucose being a very high energy sugar, but being hard to break down. We get all of our energy from sugars that we eat. So we eat, we get glucose in our body, and we need to start breaking this down in order to form ATP. So how do we do that? So we have a molecule of glucose, and then we have an enzyme that takes phosphates from already formed ATP and adds them to the glucose in order to make it unstable. We use 2 ATP to break apart 1 glucose. So when we have glucose, we add 2 ATP and we form glucose 6-phosphate. This then breaks up into 2 different molecules of G3P, and then they each form 2 ATP and 1 NADH each. We also have a resultant of 2 pyruvate, 1 for each breaking apart. So our net gain here is 2 ATP, 2 NADH, and 2 pyruvate. Now this isn't very much, but using this NADH and the pyruvate, we can actually generate more energy from the next cycles that we're going to be taking a look at. So this is the Krebs cycle, and the Krebs cycle is where we're going to use the pyruvate. It occurs in the mitochondria, and it does require oxygen. If there is no oxygen, the cycle will stop. So it forms NADH. That's the entire purpose of the cycle. For the last cycle that we're going to be taking a look at that generates the most energy out of anything. So the whole point is to form NADH. It takes, the resultants are 1 ATP per cycle, 3 NADH, and 1 FADH2. So we have our pyruvate, and then we add an enzyme to it, which breaks off a CO2 and forms 1 molecule of NADH and 1 acetyl-CoA. And the acetyl-CoA is what's going to go through this cycle here. So using our acetyl-CoA, we're going to add in some oxaloacetate and form citric acid. And we use 7 more steps. The primary step actually forms the majority of our energy, and the rest is just reforming this oxaloacetate so it can go through the cycle again. Now remember, from our glycolysis, we actually have 2 pyruvate. So we're going to go through this cycle twice because we're going to form 2 acetyl-CoAs. And so we're going to have a net gain of 2 ATP, 6 NADH, and 2 FADH2. Again, we haven't actually formed that much net ATP. We formed a total of 4 net ATP, 2 from this cycle and 2 from this cycle. The cycle that we're going to look at next is actually the majority of the energy that's going to be formed. And this is the electron transport chain. It occurs in the membrane of the mitochondria, and it is aerobic. It requires oxygen and will not happen if oxygen is not present. So here I've drawn a diagram of what's actually happening in the electron transport chain. And the entire purpose of this is this one machine right here, the ATP synthase. This forms all the ATP our body could ever need. And it forms it by taking in protons from the inner membrane, from the proton gradient that's here, and it spits them out this way, and that's where the ATP is formed through this machine. We need more protons to be on the inner than the outer, or else protons are not going to be going into the ATP synthase here. And so we need a proton gradient where all the protons over here want to flow to the outside. So how do we do that? And that's why we have these 4 sub-machines, I guess you could call them. So we have our NADH from our Krebs cycle, and it comes through to the electron transport chain, and NADH is carrying high energy electrons. Every NADH carries high energy electrons, and it drops off 2 electrons into the very first submachine. And these electrons, the energy from the electrons, actually helps this to pump protons from the outside to the inner membrane. And that's what forms this gradient here, because it's a proton pump. The electrons then go into coenzyme Q, and then goes into our second submachine, which is the same thing as the first. And then, yet again, to our third, and then to our fourth. And the fourth machine here takes in 4 electrons. And again, just like the others, it puts protons from the outer membrane to the inner membrane in order to form this proton gradient. Oxygen is our final electron acceptor, and that's how we get rid of all these old electrons. And that's why we need to breathe, because if there is no oxygen to accept these electrons, everything will come to a halt. The protons will be equal on both sides. We won't generate any ATP, and our body will end up shutting down. So the oxygen comes in, accepts the electrons, and then is breathed out in the form of CO2. So this forms the majority of our energy. For each cycle, it's 2 on the glycolysis, 2 on the Krebs cycle, and the total amount of energy from 1 NADH here is 34 ATP, generating a total of 38 ATP every single time we run this cycle.